So, the title of the panel is Mobile First and World Domination Second. And hosting the panel will be the European editor of The Next Web, Mr. Robin Wauters. Give it up for him.
Good
Stage is yours.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So, Austria's Got Talent. We're not the next dance act. We actually have a mobile panel. Here are our panelists. See?
Sorry,
take a seat, guys.
We're trying to emulate the previous
Take a seat wherever you want.
guests.
I'm going to sit down in a second as well and introduce the panelists. But first, I wanted to share a couple of numbers just to set the scene. So the mobile market is obviously very big. It's a $220 billion market. Just to give you an idea, Strategy Analytics is a research firm. They estimate that there are now about 1 million smartphones in use worldwide. Smartphones, not just phones. Google's obviously one of the big ones with Android. Android and iOS make up together 85% of the smartphone market when it comes to operating systems, so that's huge. Android has about 700,000 applications now in the store, which is about as many as Apple has in the App Store for iOS. And there are a number of companies that are also competing against those two juggernauts. You have Microsoft with Windows Phone making strides. You're going to do a huge push, as I'm sure you know, next year with Surface and Windows Phone 8. And then you have others like Nokia and BlackBerry. They still exist, let's say. And then obviously we have even Mozilla going into this market with Firefox OS next year. So it's a huge market, a lot of things happening, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to have a seat. So from left to right, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today. We have Keith Teare, who's a serial entrepreneur. He's been starting companies since the early 80s.
First company was 1981.
1981, there you go. So serial entrepreneur, started companies like Real Names, EasyNet, Seascape. He's co-founder of TechCrunch as well. Full disclosure, I used to work for TechCrunch, so he was kind of my boss for a while. And he's also the co-founder of Archimedes Labs, which is a Palo Alto-based incubator and accelerator. And his latest startup that he's launching now is called Just.me. There you go. And we're going to talk about that in a second. To his left is Don Dodge. He's a developer. He heads up the developer relations at Google, so he helps developers make applications based on Google's platforms and technologies. And Mobilegeek, who happens to run a blog called Mobilegeeks. You have Sascha Pallenberg, who's a blogger based in Taiwan. He's based in Taipei, and he's been writing about the mobile industry longer than most of us have been reading about the mobile industry. So glad to have you guys on the panel. So I mentioned earlier that Apple, iOS, and Android now make up 85% of the market in terms of smartphone OS. Do you think that there's ever going to be a third player that's going to be worth being, is it going to be a three-horse race, or is it going to be those two and scraps for the rest of them?
Well, just to be controversial, that's true if you look at the market from the point of view of devices shipped and sold. But if you look at the market from the point of view of dollars earned, I think Apple is about 93% of the market and Android is about 7%. So it depends whether a market is defined by the devices or by the money that flows. And so the real question is, will there be a second player?
Right.
And I personally think that Apple is so dominant because of the app ecosystem. Obviously, the excellence of the devices and the software is interesting, but what's really interesting is the replacement of the browser as the consumption tool for services and apps with apps themselves that are running on the device rather than in the cloud, and therefore can't be consumed through a browser. That seems to have changed the world and the money flows in the world to make Apple be capable of earning billions of dollars every quarter. And that's changed with a capital C. Everything that we assumed to be true, like build a website if you're a startup, nimble startups that ship first and iterate later, which are all Web 2.0 concepts, don't really hold water in a hit-driven app world where your first offering has to be awesome. Otherwise, you're dead, just like a song that doesn't make the hit parade.
Right. So you're arguing that revenue-wise, it's a one-horse race, really. I'm sure that both of you are going to disagree with that, so I would love to hear Don's thoughts on this.
Apple and Google are playing very different games. Apple is getting their revenue from hardware, and it's a very good business for them. Google is playing a different game. Our game is all about traction and market share, and our revenue comes from advertising. So it's a very different scenario. We are very, very happy with the success of Android. It's by far the market leader and growing. And for us, it's a great revenue stream, but it's a different revenue stream than Apple. Now, is there going to be a third player? Apple does hardware, Google does advertising, Microsoft makes its money from licensing their operating system. And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult business to grow. The success of Android has been driven largely by developers building applications on that platform. How are you going to convince developers that they should develop an Apple app, an Android app, and then spend more money on a very small percentage of the market? It's going to be very difficult.
What do you think, Sascha? 3-horse race, 4-horse race?
Disagree a little bit with Keith on these numbers, right? Actually, it's a battle of two companies. We have Apple and Samsung. 90% of the revenue that is getting generated in the mobile markets is generated by these two companies. And if Apple is successful, Samsung is going to be successful because they're still producing their SoCs and their displays and their memory. So without Samsung, Apple couldn't exist right now on this market.
So just for context, Samsung, I wrote this down, they shipped 57 million phones in Q3 alone this year, and they're making a shitload of money on the Android.
And they're even outselling Apple right now on the smartphone side. I also have to disagree with Don a little bit because Google turned into a hardware manufacturer right now. We just had this huge announcement of Nexus. Nexus is becoming a product. It's becoming a brand. The way they've been branding now their smartphone, their entry-level tablet, and their high-end tablet by saying Nexus 4, Nexus 7, Nexus 10, gives us a little idea of the future of what Google is going to do with it, right? They're still embracing their OEMs that they're supporting for so many years right now, but we also know that they acquired Motorola, right? And I'm not so sure how this is going to work out at the end. So the question is if Microsoft, that also had this huge launch event on Monday, and actually that's the first time I left my house in the last 3 years without using an Android phone. I'm using a new Nokia Lumia 920 here. Nokia's are paying me for saying this.
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. That's why I'm pitching it here.
And Microsoft isn't paying you either. So it must be really good.
You know what, this is not a sprint race we are on here. When we're looking at the global smartphone market and the penetration of smartphones on the global mobile phone market, we are roughly at around 45 to 50%, especially on the Western markets. We still have a long way to go, mainland China, in India, and Africa. So there are at least like 50% of people still using a feature phone, right? And this is they're going to migrate over to a smartphone or adopt a smartphone in the next couple of years. And right now, after being complaining about Microsoft and their strategy for so many years, because I thought they just couldn't get it, and I also thought that Windows Phone 7 wasn't there at all. It felt to me like they want to rush something to the market just to have something. Right? We are still here. But I think right now they have a competitive product, a competitive platform. And you know what? It can only be good for even an iOS developer or even for Google, right, to have more competition on this market. I'm just sick and tired of reviewing Android and iOS smartphones and tablets. They're all the same.
So I agree with Sascha on the scale. You make a real good point about Samsung, and I modify what I said in light of you're quite right. But you make a real good point about the scale. If you think about the time when Nokia was the leader with Symbian, I remember that the stats every quarter were roughly 1 billion new phones shipped worldwide. And there's no reason to believe that the quarterly numbers for smartphones 1 or 2 years from now couldn't reach those kinds of numbers or even greater. Yep. If you believe that every phone shipped by then will be a smartphone, and that the price will start at 0 for the consumer and go all the way up to roughly $1,000 at the top end. There's no reason to believe that it couldn't be 1 billion units per quarter, and that all of the 4 billion smartphone users on the planet at that point will be using software and services from either Apple, Google, or Microsoft, and probably a combination of all three on each device, no matter who the device is run by. And that that market, when you talk about it, the real question you've got to ask is, what does that imply for software developers? What does it imply for marketers? What does it imply for product developers, designers? What does it mean for engineering, which will cease to be engineering-led and will very quickly become design-led as the user interface on those devices takes hold? The number of things that are going to change and the amount of money flowing through that ecosystem is going to make Web 2.0 look very, very small.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. I'm actually looking forward to the day where we're going to stop using the terms feature phones and smartphones and just call it phones again, because they're all going to be smartphones, really. So you touched on the developer side of the business, Don. I wanted to ask you, because we know that Apple recently said it paid $6.5 billion to developers to date since the launch of the App Store in 2008. How's that going for Google? How many Android developers are making a lot of money with Android?
I can't share any numbers, specific numbers with you, but
well, you can.
You can look at the market share, and you know that Android is by far the market leader. The Android store and the App Store is catching up with the iPhone App Store and having very good success. So we're very happy with the success there, and developers are making lots and lots of money. We have more and more apps coming into the store every day, and I think if you're a developer, you have to think about, where am I going to put my development resources? You have limited resources, and Android is one of the top two choices, so we're happy with that. You should remember that 2012 was the first year where there were more smartphones sold than PCs, than laptops. First time this year, and that is accelerating, so there's going to be more and more and more smartphones sold. This is my computer. I didn't carry a laptop here. Who wants to carry a heavy laptop? This is my computer. And when you walk into your office, you'll have a flat screen and a keyboard, and this is your computer. No more carrying around laptops. That's where we're going. This is much more powerful than the laptop that I had 3 years ago. So it's a huge, huge change.
But
is there a future for desktop computing devices?
But what I was going to say, that I don't know, Don probably can't talk about this, A, because he's probably doesn't know all the facts, and B, because even if he did, he wouldn't be able to talk about them.
Right.
But there is an interesting big issue there related to advertising as a business model, which is that the CPMs, the cost per view that is earned by Facebook and Google, and let's say, generally speaking, the companies that grew up with the web on the desktop are much bigger than those earned on mobile currently. And as the shift to mobile happens, Facebook just announced 600 million mobile users. If that is a replacement behavior, as Don just described, if you're no longer going to your desktop or your laptop, and you're exclusively using mobile devices, then at some point, the rate of growth has already begun to decline in those revenues. At some point, the absolute revenues start to decline. And mobile needs to take over as the revenue-earning arm. And clearly on mobile, the advertising formats that worked on the desktop at least work less well. Some would argue don't work at all. And we need, as an industry, to be creative to figure out what the mobile formats for advertising are going to be. Right. I know Larry Page recently on a conference call talked about click-to-call as being one of those, but that probably isn't sufficient. There's probably a lot more innovation needed about about what mobile advertising revenues are going to be. Otherwise, you'll see the Facebook effect and the Google effect of declining cost per click growth becoming absolute revenue decline. As that platform, and I believe you're right, Don, as that desktop platform, just measured in the number of hours per day we use it, declines to 0, something has to give.
Well, advertising is going to be different. Advertising on mobile is going to be completely different than advertising on the web, and in a good way. Remember back in 1995 when websites were first coming out, remember the advertising that you had? It was these flashing GIFs and banner ads and towers. It was ridiculous, right? And it didn't work. So people who try to take the existing advertising that they're using on websites and put it on mobile are not going to be successful. There's going to be a different model that works. Google figured that out on the web. While everyone else was doing GIFs and crazy display ads, Google did text ads based on search. We're going to figure it out again on mobile, and mobile is going to be a gigantic market, but it's going to be different.
It'll be interesting to watch. Sascha, back to your previous point, actually, because we talked about computing devices being replaced by mobile devices.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is a pretty bold statement. Do you agree with it?
No, I don't.
Not?
And I tell you why. It's very hard to make here general statements on a global market because you have absolutely fragmented world. The digital divide is huge, right? And it's getting bigger and bigger each and every year. I'll give you an example. Our Western markets are saturated with PCs, right? Each and every household has at least one PC right now. So we're buying more and more devices. We're getting a tablet, right? And then all of a sudden Apple is telling us you also need to get a smaller tablet, and the next one is going to be, I don't know, Apple iPad mini macro or whatever. And you need to have your smartphone, you need to have your console, you have your set-top box and whatnot. We're getting more and more devices, which also is a huge opportunity again for developers because we're talking about interconnectivity, we're talking about M2M markets and whatever. So let's look, for example, to mainland China or to India. At a family that makes like roughly $600 or $700 a year, they can't afford an iPhone. They can't afford a PC. They also can't afford even a low-level Android phone. Right? The first thing they're going to buy is maybe a $45 tablet from Shenzhen, which is immediately becoming their first PC. It's also becoming their very first TV station. Right? It's becoming their first camera. It's becoming their first radio. Right? It's a kind of all-in-one device. It's kind of interesting because in India, actually, smartphones or phones with projectors in there are very popular because they just can't afford a TV set. So they're buying a phone and they're sharing it with 2 or 3 families and are just kind of projecting their movies, their Bollywood movies, to the wall, and then they have a huge, basically a smart TV. So it's very, very hard to say that a phone right now, as the phone that we have right now, will replace a PC. I'm sorry, I still have to write. And I still need to have a proper operating system because neither iOS or Android is capable of not only running a proper multitask management or a Windows manager. It's just a pain in the ass to be productive on a device like this.
So you mentioned,
sorry, go ahead, Dom.
Sascha, you mentioned the digital divide, and the digital divide is real. It costs a lot of money to buy a PC. It takes technical experience to be able to use a PC, and then you need an internet connection to make it work and make it useful. Those things are very expensive. So the digital divide was real. Mobile phones are closing the digital divide. Google's goal is to drive the cost of mobile devices to 0. We give away the operating system. We're bringing down the price. And by bringing down the price of smartphones so that anyone can afford them, that's going to close the digital divide. The second thing is, smartphones are easy to use. If you can use your finger, you can use this computer because the interface is just touch with your computer. So these are much easier to use than PCs. So that's going to close the digital divide and make it so that grandmothers and little kids can use computers. That's the future. Now, you're right, it's going to take longer to get there than some people think, but the direction is clear. It's going to be mobile devices they're going to be easy to use, and we're going to drive the cost to zero or as close to zero as we can get.
I think, Sascha, you were making 2 points, and I would separate them. The point about productivity and the need for a desktop or a laptop to accomplish various goals, which the audience seemed to respond well to, that's clearly true for work-related, spreadsheets and such. It may be less true in the future as the software evolves, but I think you're right today. The time when I sit at a desktop is when I have to do work with a capital W. But I will say the time in the day when I have to do that is shrinking more and more. More and more of what I do I can accomplish without going to my desktop. So I think even though you're right to insist that this is a relative, not an absolute shift, it's still a very, very meaningful shift. And your second point, in a way, contradicts your first. The $45 tablet from Shenzhen will accelerate what Don just described, the close in the digital divide, and make it more likely that a poor family from India...
No, absolutely, and that was my point. By separating these two different markets and saying, you know what, for those guys, they're going to adopt mobile phones way quicker than we are actually doing. Because, I mean, we have a different user scenario over here. About 40 or 45% of the European employees are working in the service society. We're making the switch into the information technology society. We're on the hump. I live in Taiwan, where about 45% of the people are already working in the information technology society. Try to tell them, you need to get rid of your PC right now. You have to work with your smartphone. They will tell you something else.
You can't, but the only reason... I think we all agree you can't work with a capital W with a smartphone if work is defined in a certain way. If work is email or texting, which a lot of work is.
How many people are making 100% of their income from email? I don't know so many. If you're a very professional email marketer, that might work out, right?
Well, that's another way of saying how many people manage other people.
Oh, that's true.
And
how many people are working on a manager level?
And if you manage other people, you're communicating a lot.
Exactly. How many people are working on a manager level, on an executive level?
You're getting too complicated for me.
Yeah.
For me, it's really simple. I use this all the time. The only time I don't use this is when I need a keyboard and a big screen. And what I just said is, all you need is a flat screen and a keyboard. This is the computer. You don't need a laptop. You just need this Bluetooth connection to the keyboard and to the screen, and you're done.
Why isn't Google offering this?
Actually, Google Android 4.2, I'll become the Android champion for a minute, just shipped its version of AirPlay. And I don't know how many of you have ever used AirPlay, but if you have your iPad and you have an Apple TV, you can literally get your spreadsheet on the big screen or your PowerPoint on the big screen with no cables. It's wonderful, actually. And if you had a keyboard, you'd have the whole solution.
You're done.
So I actually believe the future is 2 screens in the cloud, not 3 screens in the cloud.
So we'll get to that in a second. I wanted to go back to the developer side of the business because we obviously have a lot of startups in the room. And one trend that I'm seeing as a journalist is a lot of startups that used to come up to me and say, we're building this web service and we'll go mobile later, are now going mobile only, or at least mobile first.
Right.
Don, you're a startup veteran. You've worked at companies like Napster and Groove and Alta Vista in the past.
Yep.
If you were doing a startup now, would you go mobile first, mobile only, or both?
Yeah, it's mobile first, web second, and desktop, who cares? I don't use any desktop apps. I use a web browser, I use the mobile apps, but desktop apps I don't use. So if I'm a startup, I'm doing mobile first and web second. And after that, it doesn't matter.
Keith?
Yeah, I don't think it's mobile only simply because you need to have the web part as the glue between various devices that don't support the native apps. So I think the web part increasingly becomes a service back end to a mobile front end rather than where the apps are consumed and run. So I think it's mobile first. Just on me, for what it's worth, we have Android, iOS, and HTML5, and we have 2 developers on each. We're a startup, so it's small teams. And then we have a back-end team that supports all 3 of those. And I think that is 8 developers.
Why not hire 2 more developers and do Windows 8?
I think you know the answer to that question. I don't want to be rude to my former colleagues at Microsoft.
Me either. I used to work at Microsoft.
So you've touched on HTML5, so it brings us to the next question. Is it going to be an app-centric world, or is HTML5 going to disrupt that?
I think Opera already made the statement back in 2004 that in the future we are all coming back to the browser.
Do you think that's true?
I can only second that.
So
it's maybe not now. We still have the huge momentum on the app market, but especially for a developer, you know, when we always hear these fancy stories of this Starbucks developer becoming a millionaire, try to do this right now, right? 80% of the revenue that's generated on an app store is going to be produced by 20% of the developers, which are mainly huge companies, right, with hundreds of developers. So the competition is so high right now, and of course we're looking for the future, right?
Well, to be fair, you have the same long tail you see on the web and on desktop applications, so it's not really tied to mobile only. But
so I would say, philosophically, we should all want the web to survive. Why? Because hyperlinks are the means for all of us to be able to play a role collectively together. And if hyperlinks were to die and we would go back to a Windows 3.1 application-only world, that would be a worse world.
Great.
Having said that, there is a trend, and I think it's a good trend, to treat hyperlinks and browsers as being features of applications. So for example, if you use a Twitter app on Android or iOS, and you click on a hyperlink, it will open a browser window within the Twitter app and take you to the site that you just clicked on. And you don't need to have a separate browser app to achieve that. You need a browser control in the operating system. And so I think hyperlinks will survive, the web as in the web of links will survive, but consumers are going to love native apps that make use of all the graphical richness of all the devices, but will not tolerate being locked out from hyperlinks as part of the price they're prepared to pay for that. So smart developers will build for the web as a back end and will build natively on the front end.
Makes sense. Don, when a developer comes up to you and says, we're not developing for Android, or not yet, we're going iOS first because the fragmentation is a problem, what's your response?
I don't hear that a lot, personally. Fragmentation is a problem that, well, maybe Keith and Sascha can answer this better, but from a user perspective, fragmentation doesn't matter, because they only have one device, so they don't care what's happening with other devices. And from a developer's perspective, we're doing everything that we can to make that as painless a process as possible. And I just don't hear that kind of problem from developers. They're all pushing ahead, and it's not really a problem.
You used to hear it more, that's for sure.
In the past, yeah.
Before Android 4, before Ice Cream Sandwich, actually, you heard it a lot more.
Right, so it's getting better, even if more devices.
Well, it's getting better at the level of the SDK and the ability to write. It isn't yet better at the level of the penetration of the different Android versions in the market. There's a lot of 2.2 and 2.3 still in the market, so you have to deal with that. Having said that, I personally see a huge, bright star in Google's decision to embrace Nexus. I mean, to me, Nexus is almost like pure Android, separated from the rest of Android, and being, very desirous from the point of view of the consumer because it's the best in class, and it's going to remain to be supported. And if that is really what's going on there, then Google could become as easy to build for as Apple in a very straightforward way. I don't know that that is the strategy with Nexus, whether it's a short-term or a long-term kind of plan. But if it's a long-term plan, I support it. I think it's good.
Robin, I would say that the fragmentation, for whatever degree it is a problem, I don't think it is. But when you compare that to the fragmentation of browsers, remember being a developer 10 years ago when you had to develop for the different versions of Internet Explorer and Netscape and this and that, that fragmentation problem was huge, a big, big problem. The fragmentation problem on Android, not really an issue.
Think about a game developer developing for x86, right? These are like 50 gazillion different combinations of hardware components. So somehow when I hear the developers whining about this, I'm telling them, I'm going to introduce it to a game developer that has to develop for x86, right? And you're whining about a 500 kilobyte app here, right? And not a 500 gigabyte installation or whatever.
Right.
Yes, there is fragmentation, but actually, I wouldn't call it really fragmentation, I would call it segmentation, because it's also an advantage for the users. With Android, you definitely have the choice. Right, so whether I'm getting a 3-inch device for 99 euros, or I want to have the latest Samsung Galaxy Note 2 5.5-inch with quad-core, whatever, for 600 euros. So you have so many different devices for the users is definitely, and not so many users are actually, the average Joe is not complaining if it's Android running on 2.3 or Ice Cream Sandwich or Jelly Bean. They just don't know it.
But I'll tell you, as a developer myself, and just me, my team, which are heavily Java-centric and therefore love Android, actually prefer Android to iOS by a long way.
That's good.
Actually whine about a couple of things. And Google knows all this and they're doing their best. I agree with Don, they're doing their best to fix it. But there are some structural issues. One is the package files. You used to have different package files for different screen formats. And that's true up until Ice Cream Sandwich. If you want to target, if you don't adopt that SDK to target the previous platforms, you have to have multiple packs. The other thing is there's a lot of bitmaps in Android and not so much vector graphics. By the way, Apple has the same problem with iOS 5. On an iPhone 5, you get black bars at the top and the bottom of your apps unless you change them. So, there are issues. I agree that they are, in the big picture of things, issues people will deal with, but it'd be better if they didn't have to.
Right.
That's true.
So guys, we have about 20 seconds left. I'm going to close by having each one of you say if your phone could have a feature that there's no ability to have right now that you wished was possible now, what would it be? Mine would be battery life 2 days instead of 4 hours.
Wow. So if we're going into the realms of science fiction, mine would be a phone that morphs itself into the latest model when it's released. Because I buy a new phone 3 times a year.
Now that would solve a fragmentation problem for real.
I've been traveling Europe for 3 weeks, and I've used my phone. This is my GPS device. This is my translator. This is my web browser. This is my camera. This is my voice thing. It does everything. So it's only going to get better.
There's no future for phones.
What it needs is for all those things to be integrated into a really cool app.
Yeah, just me. It's good.
Sascha?
I think we should overcome SIM cards and roaming costs. That's so 1990, right?
Yes.
All right, guys.
First of all, we don't need a SIM card. A SIM card is just a piece of plastic no one needs, right?
Definitely.
And I think without roaming, more people would use the mobile internet and they will connect to more services and they would generate more revenue.
Very good closing note.
Very
guys,
good.
Thank you very much for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There we go.